A scientist put herself to sleep for 72 hours straight and something came through. The door she opened. Not a dream. Not a hallucination. Something that left physical evidence on her. Equipment gave her information she could not have known, and changed the trajectory of neuroscience in ways the academic world refuses to acknowledge. What happens when the human mind crosses the threshold of stage 5 sleep? The zone that most sleep researchers won't even study is not what they told you in school. It is not rest. It is not random firing of neurons creating meaningless imagery. It is contact. Contact with something that has always been there, on the other side of consciousness, patiently waiting for us to go deep enough to reach it. And what that thing reveals about the nature of reality, about who we truly are, and about why the mainstream scientific establishment has quietly buried 70 years of sleep research, will leave you completely breathless. Because the experiment I am about to describe did not fail. It succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. And that is exactly why nobody talks about it. If you want to understand the true nature of sleep, the hidden architecture of the human mind, and what is actually waiting for you on the other side of consciousness, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. And if you are someone who has always felt that your dreams are more than dreams, that something in the night reaches toward you, that your sleeping mind travels to places your waking mind cannot name, then the guide in the first pinned comment below was made for you. The book Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence is for those who are ready to go further. Because what I am about to share will not just change how you think about sleep, it will change how you think about everything. Dr. Eleanor Marsh was 52 years old and had spent the last 26 years of her life studying the thing that everyone does every night and almost no one understands. Sleep. Not the popular science version of sleep, the one that talks about memory, consolidation and cellular repair and how you need 8 hours or your cortisol spikes. Eleanor knew all of that. She had written about all of that. 3 textbooks. 4 to 7 peer-reviewed papers. A tenured position at a well-regarded university in Portland, Oregon. A research laboratory with equipment that cost more than most people's houses. She was, by every external measure, a success. But Eleanor had a secret. A professional secret she had never published, never presented at conferences, never mentioned to colleagues over dinner or drinks. A secret that had been growing inside her like a splinter buried too deep to remove, pressing against something vital, for almost a decade. She believed, no, she knew, with the certainty of someone who had spent thousands of hours inside the data, that mainstream sleep science was hiding from the most important discovery in the history of neuroscience. It had started in 2014, during a routine analysis of polysomnographic recordings. From a long-term sleep study, Eleanor was looking at brainwave data from subjects in extended deep sleep, specifically the slow wave and REM transition phases that most researchers glossed over as transitional noise. And she found something that stopped her cold. A pattern. Not a random pattern. A coherent, repeating, structured signal in the brainwave. Data that did not match any known neurological template. Not delta waves. Not theta. Not the familiar architecture of any established sleep stage. Something else. Something that appeared consistently, in subject after subject, in the deepest windows of the night, usually between 3 and 4 in the morning. A frequency range she had never seen documented anywhere in the existing literature. She had labeled it, in her private notes, Stage 5. Not to be confused with the sleep stages most people learn about. The existing model, light sleep, deep sleep, REM, and back again, had been standard since the 1950s. But Eleanor's data suggested that there was a fifth state, deeper than deep sleep, more structured than REM, that occurred in the early hours of the morning in subjects who were physically healthy, emotionally stable, and had been sleeping continuously for more than 5 hours. A state that the brain, under the right conditions, could enter. A state that the existing model did not account for. A state that, when she began looking backward through archived data from studies conducted across 3 decades, appeared in nearly every long-duration sleep recording she examined, always overlooked, always classified as artifact or noise, always quietly discarded. She had brought her findings to her department head. He had smiled patiently and told her she was probably looking at equipment interference. She had brought them to a colleague she respected, a man who ran the country's largest sleep disorder clinic. He had studied the data for 20 minutes, said nothing, and handed it back to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. 2 months later, a significant portion of the research funding that Eleanor's lab relied on was quietly redirected to another department. No explanation given. No conversation. The money simply moved. She had not been fired. She had not been publicly discredited. That was not how it worked. Instead, she had been slowly, systematically, peacefully edged toward irrelevance. Fewer invitations to present at conferences. Fewer mentions in major publications. A sense, never stated but always present, that her research was leading somewhere the institution did not want to go. By 2023, Eleanor was technically still tenured, technically still running a lab, but operating in a kind of professional twilight. The colleagues who had once called her brilliant now greeted her with polite distance. The graduate students who had once competed to work with her now chose other supervisors. She taught her classes, maintained her lab, and conducted her research in increasingly deliberate isolation. The stage 5 data sat in a hard drive she kept locked in her desk drawer. Hundreds of thousands of data points. Years of careful analysis. A discovery she was more certain of than anything she had ever studied. And no one would listen. Outside the university, Eleanor's life was similarly quiet. Her marriage had ended 7 years ago, amicably, to a man who loved her but could not compete with the obsession. Her daughter lived in Denver and called every Sunday. She had a cat named Plank, after the physicist, who slept on her research papers, with what she privately considered appropriate irony. On a Tuesday evening in mid-January, Eleanor was alone in her house in the West Hills of Portland. Rain against the windows. A glass of red wine going warm on the desk beside her. And on her computer screen, a new academic paper, published that morning in a major journal, confidently declaring that human sleep was now essentially fully mapped and that the primary remaining questions were pharmaceutical optimization of the existing stages. Eleanor read that sentence 3 times. Essentially fully mapped. She thought about the hard drive in her desk drawer. She thought about the pattern that appeared in hundreds of subjects across decades of recordings. She thought about stage 5, unnamed, unrecognized, buried under the comfortable certainty of people who had decided what sleep was before they finished looking. She closed the paper. She sat in the dark for a long moment. And then she made a decision she had been circling for 3 years. She was going to run the experiment. The one she had designed and never executed. The one that her colleagues would call reckless. The one that required a subject willing to sleep in a controlled environment for 72 hours continuously, under constant monitoring, with the specific protocol she had developed to maximize the likelihood of entering and sustaining stage 5. The subject she had in mind was herself. It took her 6 weeks to set everything up properly. Eleanor was, above all, a scientist, and she was not going to do this carelessly. She had the lab to herself most evenings and weekends. She installed additional monitoring equipment, a secondary EEG array more sensitive than the standard clinical gear, infrared cameras, a digital audio recorder that would capture environmental sounds in the frequency range below normal human hearing, and a sensor array designed to detect fluctuations in the electromagnetic field of the room. That last piece of equipment required some explanation. Eleanor had found, In her years of studying stage 5 data, something she had documented carefully and never published. When subjects entered what she believed was stage 5, the electromagnetic readings in the monitoring room changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger alarms or appear obviously anomalous, but consistently. A slight reduction in ambient EM field strength, followed by a brief period of organized, patterned fluctuation that didn't match any known source of interference. She wanted to document that. Whatever it was, she wanted the data. For the subject's protocol, her own protocol, she had designed a specific pre-sleep regimen based on a decade of observational analysis. Low stimulus environment for 48 hours prior. No screens after 6 p.m. A specific sequence of breathing exercises that she had noticed, in the data, seemed correlated with faster and more frequent stage 5 entry. Light meals. No alcohol. No caffeine. For 5 days. And a sleep schedule artificially shifted 3 hours later than her normal rhythm, because her data suggested stage 5 was more accessible when the body's circadian expectations were gently, deliberately disrupted. She told her department coordinator she was running an equipment calibration test. She told her daughter she was going on a short research retreat. She asked a graduate student she still trusted, a young woman named Sarah who had read enough of Eleanor's private notes to take the work seriously, to check on her every 12 hours, from outside the lab, without entering. On a Thursday night in late February, Eleanor lay down on the monitoring bed in her sleep laboratory, electrodes attached, recording equipment running, the city of Portland going about its business 5 floors below. She closed her eyes, and the experiment began. The first 24 hours were unremarkable by any dramatic measure. Eleanor slept. The equipment recorded. She cycled through normal sleep architecture. N1, N2, slow wave, REM, as expected. Sarah knocked twice, confirmed equipment. Status through the intercom, left. Eleanor's brainwaves followed familiar patterns. Nothing strange. Nothing anomalous. But Eleanor, reviewing the data during a brief waking period at the 22-hour mark, noticed something that made her sit up straighter. Stage 5 had appeared. Just once. Briefly. At 3:17 in the morning of the second night. Lasting 41 seconds. And during those 41 seconds, the EM sensor had recorded a coherent fluctuation. She had been right. It was there. She lay back down with a focus so intense it felt almost physical and went back to sleep. The second full night was different. Eleanor woke, partially, at an hour she estimated was somewhere near 4 a.m. Though she didn't check. Something had changed in the room. Not a sound. The room was sealed, the building quiet at that hour. Not a smell, not a physical sensation. A change in quality. Like the difference between an empty auditorium and an auditorium where someone is sitting in the dark in the back row. A presence. Not threatening. Not benevolent. Simply present. The way an observer is present. She was rational enough to categorize this immediately as hypnopompic experience, the perceptual distortions that sometimes accompany the boundary between sleep and waking. She documented it in the brief audio note she had set up for exactly this purpose, and went back to sleep. But she didn't entirely believe her own categorization, because she had felt this before, once, years ago, in the early days of studying stage 5, during a late night in the lab when she was reviewing data from a long-duration study. Subject. She had felt it and dismissed it then, too. The third night was the one that changed everything. Eleanor had been under continuous monitoring for 61 hours when it happened. She was in a deep sleep cycle, deeper than she had gone in the previous 2 nights, her slow wave activity more pronounced, her body more completely surrendered to the protocol. The equipment was running silently. The lab was dark except for the indicator lights on the monitoring array. And then she was awake, but not in the way that waking normally felt. Normal waking was gradual. A slow reassembly of self, a reaching back for the sense of who you were, where you were, what time it was. This was different. This was instantaneous. One moment she was deeply asleep. The next she was completely, perfectly, sharply conscious, lying on her back on the monitoring bed, aware of every detail of the room around her with a clarity that felt heightened rather than normal. And the room was not empty. In the corner near the equipment rack, the exact position where her EM sensor had been recording the strongest fluctuations, there was light. Not from any fixture she had installed. Not the blue glow of a screen or the red pulse of an indicator. Something else. A soft, self-contained luminescence that had no obvious source and cast no shadow. Still, patient, like something that had been waiting, without impatience, for a very long time. Eleanor's scientific training activated immediately. Her first thought was not fear. It was, document this. She turned her head slowly, making sure her movements would be captured on the infrared camera. She forced her breathing to remain measured and even for the audio record. She kept her eyes open, watching, and then the light moved. Not erratically, not randomly, with deliberate, smooth, unhurried intention. And as it moved it organized itself, condensed itself, took on a form that pressed against the limits of the word form. Not human. Not the gray caricature of popular culture. Something that was simultaneously precise and impossible to describe directly, as if the visual cortex was receiving input it had no adequate template for and was doing its best to render something coherent from it. What Eleanor saw was luminous, symmetrical, self-contained, radiating an intelligence that was not communicated through expression or gesture but simply present in the being of it, the way intelligence is present in a deep eye even before the mouth has spoken a word. And then it communicated, not in sound, in understanding. Meaning arrived in her mind not as heard words, but as complete concepts, downloaded rather than spoken, bypassing language, while retaining precision. You have opened a door that your field does not acknowledge exists. Stage 5 is not a neural state. It is a frequency of consciousness. What you have been measuring is the signature of contact. We have been here every night for the entirety of human history. You are simply the first of your generation to build equipment sensitive enough to record the evidence and honest enough not to explain it away. We have been waiting for someone like you. Eleanor, whose entire career had been built on rigorous skepticism, found herself not with an impulse to dismiss but with something rarer, the impulse to listen. She thought, not aloud but clearly, "Who are you?" And the understanding came back. Observers. We predate your civilization by measures your current mathematics cannot comfortably express. We exist in a frequency adjacent to your physical reality, separated by what your science calls the threshold of consciousness. Sleep is the door. Stage 5 is the key. Every night, in the hours before dawn, when the biological mind releases its grip on physical reality long enough, the door opens, and most humans pass through it and return without remembering. But the contact happens. It has always happened. Your dreams are not random. Your sense of having been somewhere real, upon waking, is not imagination. You have been with us. Eleanor had a lifetime of professional reflex against exactly this kind of thinking. She was aware of that reflex. She was aware of how this would sound to anyone she told. She was aware, with cold scientific clarity, that she was 60-plus hours into a sleep deprivation-adjacent protocol that could produce profound perceptual effects. She was also aware that the EM sensor in the corner of the room was, at this exact moment, recording the most coherent organized pattern it had ever recorded. She could see the display from where she lay. The data was real. Whatever was happening, something physical was happening alongside it. She asked, "Why do you contact humans through sleep?" "Because during waking consciousness, the analytical mind functions as a closed system. It processes only what it expects to find. It rejects input that has no prior template. Sleep dissolves that filter. The deeper the sleep, the more complete the dissolution. Stage 5 is the state where the filter is gone entirely, where consciousness is present without the interference of expectation, and in that state, communication is possible. Your ancestors knew this. Every culture that documented dreaming as sacred was documenting something real. The oracle who slept in the temple. The shaman who entered trance. The mystic who achieved what your tradition calls contemplative prayer. All different pathways to the same destination. The threshold where your frequency and ours overlap. We have been teaching through that threshold for as long as your species has existed. What you call mythology is mostly a record of what was received there. Then Eleanor asked the question that had been building from the first moment. What are you teaching? And the visitor said, come. I will show you rather than tell you. I can take your consciousness into the architecture of what I am describing so that you experience it directly. Not hallucination, experience. The difference is data. You will return with verifiable information you did not have before. This is how we always work. Truth must be felt before it can be known. Eleanor, who had spent her career in evidence, said, show me. And the room in Portland dissolved. Eleanor was not dreaming. She was certain of this with a clarity that surpassed normal certainty, the way you are certain of physical pain, not because you have convinced yourself, but because the information is simply too real to be anything else. She was somewhere else. Not nowhere, somewhere. A space that had texture and depth and a quality of presence she lacked words for. Not visual exactly, though. She perceived it. Not dark, not light, something prior to that distinction. And in this space, the visitor was with her, not beside her but present throughout it. And the communication continued. I want you to understand where sleep comes from, the visitor said, and hear the word said is inadequate, but language must approximate. Where sleep comes from. Not the biological mechanism. The original architecture. And Eleanor perceived, not watched, not observed from the outside, but somehow participated in a kind of unfolding. A cosmological story told in direct experience rather than narrative. Consciousness, the visitor communicated, is not produced by the brain. This is the fundamental error of your current neuroscience, and it is not an accidental error. It is a conclusion reached by studying only the hardware and ignoring the signal. The brain is a transceiver. It receives and transmits consciousness, as a radio receives and transmits signal. When the brain is damaged, reception is impaired. But this does not mean the signal is generated in the hardware. What your species calls the mind is the signal. It exists independently of the biological structure that currently carries it. When the body dies, the signal does not end. It separates from the hardware and continues in the frequency range from which it came. And sleep, Eleanor intuited the next step even before it was communicated. Sleep is a nightly rehearsal of that separation. Yes, every night, the signal loosens its grip on the hardware. In light sleep it hovers close. In deep sleep it moves further. In REM it begins to operate, somewhat independently, which is why dreams have a reality logic that waking consciousness recognizes as vivid even while being structurally impossible. And in stage 5, the state you have been documenting, the signal separates almost completely. The body remains. The hardware remains, maintaining all biological functions. But the consciousness, the signal, crosses the threshold and enters the adjacent frequency range where we exist. This is not metaphor. This is mechanics. Eleanor felt the truth of it the way you feel a mathematical proof click into place, not faith, not belief, but recognition. Of course, the pattern in the data The organized brainwave signature that looked like nothing else in the existing literature. Stage 5 wasn't a deeper level of the known sleep stages. It was a different category altogether. A transition state. An open door. The visitor continued. Your species discovered this independently, multiple times. Across multiple civilizations that had no contact with each other. The Vedic tradition mapped the sleep states with extraordinary precision thousands of years before your current scientific era, identifying what they called turiya, the fourth state of consciousness, as distinct from waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Your stage 5 is turiya, the threshold state. The crossover. The ancient Egyptians built temples with specific acoustic and geometric properties that induced this state deliberately in initiates. The Tibetan tradition developed a practice called dream yoga specifically to navigate the threshold consciously rather than passing through it in oblivion. Indigenous cultures on every continent developed their own pathways, ritual, plant, medicine, rhythmic sound, extended isolation, all pointing toward the same destination, the state where the biological filter dissolves and direct contact becomes possible. And what was received through those contacts? Eleanor asked, though the question felt almost unnecessary. She could sense the answer already approaching. Everything your species considers wisdom, the visitor replied. The mathematical insights that arrived fully formed to sleeping scientists. The musical compositions that appeared complete to composers who could not explain how they had arrived. The solutions to engineering problems, the visions that founded religious movements, the understanding of natural law that preceded experimental verification. All of it came from this threshold. Not from genius, exactly, though the mind that can hold the information upon waking must be capable, but from contact. From the nightly door that opens whether you know it or not. And when you know it, when you approach it consciously, as you did with your protocol, as the ancient traditions did with theirs, the contact deepens and the information transferred becomes richer. You, Eleanor, have been studying the door from the outside for 26 years. Tonight, you walked through it. And now I can show you what is on the other side. The experience shifted, not abruptly but with the quality of a lens finding focus, and Eleanor found herself in a different kind of perceiving. She was, somehow, witnessing a human being asleep. Not clinically, not from the perspective of a researcher watching a monitoring display. She was perceiving the sleeping person from the inside and outside, simultaneously, in a way that waking consciousness had no adequate frame for. She could see the body, a woman, middle-aged, somewhere ordinary, a bedroom, with the blue light of a phone charging on the nightstand, and she could simultaneously perceive the consciousness, the signal, loosening. She watched, experienced, the process the visitor had described. The gradual separation. Light sleep, the signal hovering just above the body like fog above water. Deep sleep, a greater distance opening, the signal moving outward with the slow inevitability of tide. And then, the threshold. Stage 5. The signal. Fully separating, crossing into the adjacent frequency, entering a space that was not physical and not non-existent. A space that had its own geography, its own population, its own reality logic entirely. The sleeping woman did not know she was here. That was the tragedy the visitor communicated without words. She was here, fully present in this space, receiving, and transmitting and contacting, and when she woke she would have only fragments. If that. A vivid dream she couldn't quite hold. A feeling of having been somewhere important. The residue of an encounter with something real that the waking mind would process back into ordinary meaning and set aside. This is the loss, the visitor communicated. Not the contact itself. That happens regardless. The loss is the memory. The loss is the meaning. The waking mind's reflex is to normalize, to translate experience back into familiar categories, to explain the inexplicable encounter as a product of yesterday's news, or last week's anxiety. And in doing so, it discards information that was hard-won, specifically sought, genuinely delivered. Why? Eleanor asked. Why does the waking mind discard it? Because the waking mind is trained to distrust it. Not by nature, by culture. A child's relationship to the boundary between waking and dreaming is permeable, intuitive, naturally exploratory. Children receive information from the threshold and report it without shame or hesitation. They are then taught, systematically, and with the best intentions, that these reports are imagination, that the visitors they describe are not real, that the waking world is the only world that counts and the inner world is where you go when you can't handle the outer one. By adulthood, for most people in your current civilization, the door is not closed, it cannot be closed, but the memory of passing through it has been trained away. Eleanor thought of 40 years of sleep research that had focused almost exclusively on the biological function of sleep, the consolidation of motor learning, the clearance of metabolic waste, the regulation of emotional processing, while consistently declining to investigate what the mind actually did during the hours it spent beyond the reach of waking consciousness. Not inability, she realized. Refusal. The field knew, collectively, that there was something there. You didn't have to look at her data to sense it. The sheer volume of anecdotal experience, the globally consistent reports of encounters during sleep, the accounts of information received that could not have come from known sources, the neurologically inexplicable phenomena that clustered consistently around the early morning threshold hours, all of it pointed in a direction that the field had decided, sometime in the middle of the 20th century, not to follow. Why? She asked the visitor. Why did your own field stop looking? Not my field, the visitor replied, with something that was not quite humor but adjacent to it. Yours. And the answer is the same as the answer to most questions of this kind, because the implications were too large. If the consciousness survives the death of the body, the pharmaceutical approach to mental health requires fundamental reconsideration. If contact with non-physical intelligence is occurring nightly in virtually every human being on Earth, the institutional, religious, and scientific structures that claim authority over the nature of reality require fundamental reconsideration. The discovery was not suppressed by a conspiracy. It was suppressed by a very ordinary, very human reflex, the reflex to protect what you have built from information that would require you to build it again from the foundation. Eleanor thought of the colleague who had studied her data for 20 minutes and handed it back with that unreadable expression. He had known. She was certain of it now. He had looked at stage 5 and understood what it implied and made a private, quiet, consequential decision to set it aside. Not malice. Fear. Not the fear of being wrong. The fear of being right. The space around Eleanor shifted again, and the visitor communicated something that came not as a single statement but as a structured architecture of understanding, the way a cathedral comes at you all at once when you step inside, rather than piece by piece. Across the entirety of recorded human history, we have been using the threshold to transmit a curriculum, not to specific individuals selected for greatness, not to nations or civilizations or lineages, to every sleeping human being who enters stage 5. The curriculum is individualized, tailored to the receiver's specific developmental moment, their specific questions, their specific readiness. But the underlying content is consistent, and it is possible to identify it, running beneath the diversity of human spiritual and philosophical tradition, like a single melody played in thousands of different arrangements. The first teaching, you are not what you think you are. The self that wakes up in the morning, with its history and its name and its opinions and its fears, is a construction. A temporary, useful, genuinely important construction, the way a character in a novel is important, but not the totality of what you are. Beneath the constructed self is something else. Something that does not have a name, does not have a history, does not have fear. In the way the constructed self has fear. Something that has been present through every version of you that has existed across multiple lifetimes, multiple experiences, watching from behind the eyes of all of them. In your tradition it has been called many things: soul, Atman, higher self, the witness. The names are all attempts at the same description. Sleep is the most accessible doorway to direct experience of this deeper structure. In stage 5, the constructed self becomes temporarily quiet, and what remains is the awareness itself, uncontracted, unbounded, recognizing itself. In the way that a mirror, clean of reflection, simply is. Most people have experienced this, Eleanor realized. Waking from deep sleep with a few seconds of pure, objectless awareness before the self reassembles, before the name comes back, before the schedule comes back, before yesterday's problems come back. That gap, that few seconds of being simply awake with nothing to be awake about, that was stage 5 residue. That was the after echo of the threshold. The second teaching, reality is responsive. The physical world that your senses perceive as solid, fixed, and independent of your observation is not any of those things. It is a frequency of information, organized by the expectations of the consciousness perceiving it. This is not a New Age assertion. It is the implication of your own quantum physics, which has been sitting in your scientific literature for a century, waiting for physicists willing to follow it to its conclusion rather than stopping at the mathematical horizon. The threshold experience is, among other things, an experimental laboratory for testing this truth. In stage 5, where the constructed self's expectations are quieted, reality behaves differently. Connections become visible that waking consciousness cannot see. Information arrives that has no obvious physical source. Events that have not yet occurred can sometimes be perceived, because, from the adjacent frequency, what your timeline experiences as past and future are both visible. This is what every tradition that preserved knowledge of the threshold has tried to communicate when it spoke of prophecy, of vision, of the capacity to see what is not yet manifest. Not supernatural ability, natural ability. Consciousness operating without the limitation of the expectation filter. Eleanor thought of every time she had woken in the early hours of the morning, with a solution to a research problem she had fallen asleep wrestling with. The answer simply present, complete, obvious, arrived from nowhere. She had always attributed this to subconscious processing. But what if the subconscious was simply the name she had given to the threshold, the adjacent frequency? The space where the visitor now stood? The third teaching, you are not alone, and you never have been. This is perhaps the most important transmission we have attempted, and the most resisted by the waking mind's need to believe in the specialness of the physical. The physical universe you inhabit is one layer of a multi-frequency reality, and the other layers are populated, not by beings identical to you. The variation is, from your current vantage point, unimaginable, but populated. And many of those populations have an active, ongoing interest in your species' development. Not because you are uniquely important in any absolute sense, but because consciousness recognizes consciousness, and the development of a new form of awareness, which your species represents, is an event of genuine significance in the wider ecology of mind. We are not your gods. We are not your demons. We are, in the most accurate possible framing, your neighbors in a building you didn't know had more than one floor. And we have been sending messages through the mail slot of sleep for as long as the building has existed. The fact that your civilization currently interprets those messages as hallucination, as imagination, as the meaningless byproduct of neural maintenance, this is not a permanent condition. It is a developmental phase. The phase of a culture so invested in the primacy of the physical senses that it has temporarily lost access to the broader information it is still receiving. You, Eleanor, are part of the process of recovering that access. Not uniquely, not alone, but genuinely. The visitor then offered something that Eleanor had not expected. Not more information. Experience. Go into it, the visitor communicated. Not as observer. As participant. The threshold is not a thing to understand from the outside. It is a space to inhabit. Your protocol has opened you. Your years of preparation, the data you have gathered, the isolation you have endured, the truth you have maintained against considerable professional pressure, have prepared your system to receive more than most first encounters allow. You are ready for the full experience. Eleanor felt the shape of what was being offered, and something in her was very still and very clear, without the reflex of the skeptic or the anxiety of the scientist, just readiness. Yes, she said, in the silent language of this space. Take me in. And the threshold opened. There was no adequate description for what followed. Eleanor would spend the next 2 years trying to find one, in journal entries that grew longer and less confident that language was equal to the task. But the attempt. It was as though every wall she had ever lived behind, not just the professional walls, not just the careful skepticism that was also a kind of armor, but every wall became transparent simultaneously, and what she had been protected from, or keeping out, or unable to see through them, was not danger, was not anything frightening, was simply more reality, more presence, more information. The universe, as she knew it, the one that fit inside a scientific framework, inside the spatial coordinates of Portland, Oregon, inside the timeline of Eleanor Marsh, revealed itself to be a room inside a house, inside a city, inside a continent, inside a world she had not had access to a moment before. She perceived, there is no better word, the network. Not the neural network of her own brain, though she was present to that as well, watching it from the inside the way you can sometimes feel your own heartbeat. A larger network. A web of connected awareness that spanned beyond anything the word large could hold. Individual nodes of consciousness, each one a life, a being, a signature, connected to every other node by something that was simultaneously information and light, and something prior to both. She understood that she had been a node in this network every night of her life, connecting and receiving without knowing, the way you can be in a radio signal. 4 years without knowing you're in it. The contact she had been having, the vivid dreams, the inexplicable insights, the moments of knowing that had no obvious source, all of it had been this. The network, the curriculum, the nightly transmission she had spent her career studying without knowing what she was studying. She felt grief. Not painful grief, the kind that comes with understanding. 26 years. So close to the truth, always just on the other side of the professional reflex to explain it as less than it was. And then she felt something else. Something that dissolved the grief and the 26 years and the professional isolation and the slow institutional erasure of her work. She felt the network's response to her presence. Recognition. The way a familiar face is recognized, across time, across distance, across the particular configuration of this lifetime, something older than Eleanor Marsh, something that had been in this network before Eleanor Marsh existed and would continue after, recognizing the moment of conscious arrival and responding. You have always been here, the network communicated, in the way the threshold communicated everything, not in language but in knowing. You simply didn't know. You were here. The visitor was present beside her, not physically, the categories had dissolved, and said, this is what the ancient traditions called enlightenment, or gnosis, or the beatific vision, or 100 other names that are all attempting to describe this experience, the moment when the constructed self becomes transparent enough for the larger self to be directly perceived. Not a permanent state. You will return to your body, and the constructed self will reassemble. Because it is useful and it is yours and it is not a mistake. But the knowing will remain. The direct experience of the network cannot be unknowed. This, the visitor continued, is what the sleep research you have been doing has been pointing toward. Not a clinical state. A gateway. And the gift you have. The data you have gathered. The instrument sensitivity you have developed. The evidence that stage 5 is real and reproducible and physiologically distinct. This is not a failed career finding that nobody wants to publish. It is the scientific foundation of the most important discovery in the history of your species. The door is not metaphysical. It is measurable. And you are about to measure it. Eleanor opened her eyes in the sleep laboratory in Portland. The clock on the monitoring console said 4:47 a.m. She had been in continuous sleep protocol for 68 hours. The EM sensor was still active. She could see from where she lay that the display showed a reading unlike anything in her previous data. Not interference. Not artifact. A coherent, organized, sustained signal that had been running for the last 4 hours. The visitor was gone from the room. The light in the corner had dissolved. But the quality of the room was different. The way the quality of a room is. Different after a significant conversation has happened in it. Even after the speakers have left. Eleanor sat up slowly. Her body was stiff but not distressed. Her mind was extraordinarily clear. Clearer than she had felt in years, perhaps decades. Not the brittle clarity of sleeplessness but the clean clarity of deep completion. The way you feel after a sleep so profound that every cell seems to have been addressed. She reached for the audio recorder and began to speak, not knowing exactly what she was going to say, letting what had been received find its way into language. The mechanism is real. Stage 5 is the threshold state. The EM fluctuation is the signature of the crossing. The sleep architecture I have been documenting is the biological infrastructure of something that is not biological. The door is in every human being. It opens every night. The contact is happening. She paused, aware of how that would sound. She continued, what I experienced, I am not going to call it a hallucination. Not because I am abandoning scientific rigor. Because the hallucination interpretation requires ignoring the EM data, and I am not prepared to do that. Something produced a coherent, sustained, organized EM signal in this room for 4 consecutive hours while I was in a documented stage 5 sleep state. That is data. Whatever interpretation we apply to it, it is data, and it needs to be taken seriously. She stopped the recorder and sat with the silence of the laboratory for a long moment. Then she picked it up again and added, also, I know things I didn't know before I went under. I am going to document them before the waking mind starts editing them. And then I am going to spend the rest of my career figuring out how to tell the truth about all of it in a way that people who weren't in this room can receive. She set the recorder down and looked at the ceiling. 4 to 6 years old she had been when she first found stage 5 in the data. 6 years of professional isolation. 3 textbooks she would now need to substantially revise. A hard drive in a desk drawer that was about to become the foundation of a paper she was genuinely uncertain any journal would publish. She felt, sitting in the sleep laboratory at 4:47 in the morning, not fear. She felt purpose. The kind of purpose that doesn't need the approval of a department committee. The kind that doesn't require validation from people who have decided not to look. The kind that comes from having been somewhere and returned with something real. In the days that followed, Eleanor worked to translate what she had received into something that could stand up to scrutiny. Not the experience itself. She knew enough about epistemology to know that personal experience, however vivid, was not scientific evidence. But the data was evidence. And the framework the visitor had provided gave her a way to look at the data differently, not abandoning scientific method but extending it. The first thing she understood was the mechanism she had been missing. Stage 5 was not simply a deeper version of the existing sleep stages. It was a phase transition, a genuine change in the state of the system, the way water becomes ice or steam at specific temperature thresholds. In stage 5, the brain's default mode network, the self-referential processing system that maintains the sense of personal identity, underwent a synchronized quieting. That was qualitatively different from anything that occurred in normal sleep stages. The EM fluctuation she had been recording was not noise. It was the electromagnetic signature of that quieting, and the subsequent event it made possible. She could not, with existing instruments and methodology, directly measure what the consciousness did during stage 5. But she could measure the conditions. She could measure the door. And a measurable door was scientific progress of the highest order. The second thing she understood was why the ancient traditions had been so persistent in their preservation of threshold knowledge. Every tradition that Eleanor now examined with her new frame, Tibetan dream, yoga, Vedic nidra practices, Egyptian incubation rituals, the oracular sleep practices of ancient Greece, indigenous dreamwork traditions from cultures on every inhabited continent, had independently arrived at the same fundamental insight that the sleeping mind, under the right conditions, had access to information that the waking mind did not. That this access was consistent and learnable. That the information received through it was qualitatively different from ordinary dreaming and qualitatively similar across cultures and centuries. This was not coincidence. This was independent verification. The sample size was the entire history of human civilization. The consistency of the finding across thousands of years and dozens of completely isolated cultural traditions was exactly the kind of replication that a scientist should take seriously. And the third thing she understood, the one that stayed with her longest, in the quiet of 4 a.m. in the weeks that followed, was the personal implication. She had spent 26 years studying sleep. Every night of those 26 years, she had been passing through stage 5. Every night, the door had opened. Every night, something had been present on the other side, and contact had been made, and she had woken the next morning and gone to the university and written grants and attended faculty meetings and reviewed data on screens and been completely unaware that any of it had happened. How much had she received and discarded? How many mornings had she woken with a sense of significance she had not been able to name, and set it aside as the residue of an unremarkable night's sleep? How many times had the curriculum been delivered and the waking mind had accepted the content while erasing the source? The answer, she suspected, was every morning. The curriculum was in her. All of it. 26 years of nightly transmissions, accumulated like sediment, shaping her thinking and her intuitions and her capacity for the work she did, in ways she had never been able to account for, by pointing to any specific waking world input. The 26 years had not been wasted. They had been preparation. She had needed to build the sensitivity of the instruments. She had needed to develop the framework. She had needed to accumulate the professional isolation that freed her from the need to make her findings comfortable to the establishment. She had needed, in some sense she was still finding words for, to be exactly the scientist she was, at exactly this moment, in order to open the door with enough deliberateness that the contact could be conscious rather than ambient. She thought of all the people she knew who had experienced the threshold without knowing it. The engineer who solved his hardest problems in the first minutes after waking. The artist who found her best work waiting for her on mornings after profound sleep. The ordinary people she had interviewed across decades of research who reported inexplicable experiences in the early hours, presences, voices, information, visitations, that they had no framework to understand and no one to tell safely. They had all been in contact. All of them. Every night. The curriculum was universal. The door was democratic. The threshold did not care about credentials or cultural background or spiritual sophistication. It opened for everyone. The contact occurred for everyone. The question was only who knew how to listen. 2 weeks after the experiment, Eleanor submitted a paper to 3 journals. Not the full theoretical framework, she was not ready for that, and the field was not ready to receive it. But the data, the stage 5 EEG signature, the EM, fluctuation correlation, the evidence, carefully documented, that there was a 5th state of sleep that existing literature did not account for, with measurable electromagnetic correlates that warranted serious investigation. All 3 journals rejected it. The first 2 provided peer review responses that were civil and technically argued and concluded, each in its own way, that the signal was probably equipment artifact. The third reviewer, she recognized the writing style as someone she knew. Professionally, though the review was nominally anonymous, simply wrote, "This line of inquiry is not appropriate for this journal." Eleanor read that sentence 3 times. The same way she had read essentially. Fully mapped on that Tuesday evening in January. She put the rejection letter in a folder. She had expected it. The contact with the visitor had not made her naive about what the institutional response would be. But something had changed in her. The grief that had been the underside of her professional isolation for 9 years. The quiet, corrosive grief of being right and being ignored was gone. Not because the situation had changed. Because her relationship to it had changed. She was not fighting the institution anymore. She was not waiting for the institution to validate what she had found. She had been to the threshold and returned with something that institutional validation could not diminish and institutional rejection could not take away. She knew what she had experienced. She knew what the data showed. She knew that the EM sensor had recorded something coherent and real on that night in February, and that whatever the peer reviewers said about equipment artifact, the recording existed and was not going away. She created a website. Not an academic one. Not the stiff, cautious language of a researcher protecting herself from professional criticism. A direct one. Clue. The Sleep Threshold Project. She uploaded the data, the EEG recordings, the EM readings, the transcript of her audio notes from the night of the experiment. She wrote a plainly worded introduction. This is what I found. This is what I experienced. This is why I believe it matters. The response surprised her. Within 2 weeks, 400 people had emailed. Scientists, some retired, some still active in fields adjacent to sleep research, some in physics and engineering and consciousness studies. And non-scientists too, people who had grown up with experiences at the threshold they had never been able to explain or share. People who had always known, without being able to say why, that what happened during sleep was more than biological maintenance. People who had felt the presence in the corner of the room and been told by every available authority that they had imagined it. Thank you, they wrote, in dozens of slightly different forms. Thank you for saying what I have always known but could not say. Thank you for the data. Thank you for telling the truth. Eleanor read each one. Not quickly, not as a category, each one. The retired physicist who had been measuring EM anomalies correlated with reported visitation experiences for 20 years and had no one to share the data with. The emergency room nurse who worked the overnight shift and had seen, in the early morning hours, things she had told no one for 15 years. The teenager in a country she had to look up on a map who had been tracking her own threshold. Experiences in a journal since she was 12 and had thought she might be losing her mind until she found the website. Eleanor's thought, reading them, the curriculum is everywhere. The contact is constant. The threshold is open for everyone. All that was missing was someone willing to document it and refuse to call it something smaller than it was. She began writing. Not a paper, a book. One that combined the science she had spent her career building with the direct experience of the experiment and the transmission the visitor had offered. Not a mystical text and not a dry academic monograph. Something that could be read by the physicist and the nurse. And the teenager with the journal, all with the same sense of being seen. She called it the signal, sleep, consciousness, and the evidence for contact. She was halfway through the first draft when an email arrived from a research center in Switzerland that she had heard of but never contacted. A private institution, well-funded, operating quietly at the intersection of physics and consciousness research. They had seen her website. They had the equipment to run the follow-up studies she had described. They wanted to know if she would come and run them. She read the email 4 times. Then she thought, 8 months. The visitor had said the work would find its proper home within a time frame she recognized as approximately that. She typed, yes. She left Portland 11 months after the experiment. The hard drive with the stage 5 data went with her. Everything else, she was increasingly comfortable leaving behind. And now, having told you Eleanor's story, I want to speak to you directly. Because if you have stayed with this story to this point, if you found yourself leaning forward at the mention of stage 5, if something in you recognized the description of the threshold, if you have had your own moments of waking in the early hours with a presence in the room and the sense of something recently received that you couldn't quite hold, then you know what I am about to say before I say it. You have been to the threshold. Every night. The door has been opening for you. As it opens for every human being, without exception, without prerequisite, without the requirement of belief. The contact is happening for you right now, in the hours you spend in deep sleep, in the transition between stage 4 and what Eleanor called stage 5 and what the Vedic tradition called Turiya and what the threshold is, by any name, wherever you are, whatever you believe about consciousness and the nature of reality, you are receiving the curriculum. Whether you remember it upon waking or not, whether your waking mind processes it as a vivid dream or a quiet knowing or a wordless sense of peace, it is happening. And Eleanor's experiment did not create the threshold. It did not install the door. It documented what was already there, what had always been there, what has been waiting, with the particular patience of things that exist outside of time, for your civilization to build instruments sensitive enough to measure it and honest enough not to explain the measurement away. The 5 teachings that the visitor communicated to Eleanor in that laboratory in Portland are teachings you have been receiving, in one form or another, every night of your life. That you are more than the self that wakes up in the morning. That the constructed identity is a tool, not the totality. That beneath the name and the history and the specific fears of this particular lifetime, there is something that does not die and does not forget and recognizes itself across the full span of what it has been. That reality is responsive. That the universe is not a machine running independently of your participation in it. That consciousness shapes the information it receives, and that elevated consciousness that has quieted the expectation filter, that has approached the threshold with intention, creates a different relationship with what is possible. That you are not alone. That the network exists. That the visitors in the threshold are not a danger but a resource, older, wider, not infinitely wise, but genuinely present and genuinely interested in the development of the awareness that your species is slowly, stubbornly, magnificently building. That the evidence is everywhere, if you are willing to look at it without deciding in advance what it must mean. And that the door is not in Egypt, or Switzerland, or any specific coordinate. It is in you. It opens every night. And when you begin to approach it, consciously, with a protocol, with intention, with the willingness to remember and to tell the truth about what you find, what waits on the other side will meet you, not as a reward for spiritual achievement, not as a gift for the specially chosen, as the ordinary, miraculous, fully democratic fact of what consciousness is and where it goes when the body finally, gratefully, lets it loose in the dark. 2 years after Eleanor Marsh left Portland, she stood in a research facility in the mountains east of Geneva, watching a monitoring display that showed a subject in stage 5 for the 4th consecutive night. The EM array in the room was recording a coherent signal, as it always did now, as the data had always shown it would. Beside her stood a physicist who had spent 30 years studying quantum consciousness. Beside him stood a neurologist who had read Eleanor's website the morning after it went live and caught the first flight she could manage. A small team, a quiet room, the equipment humming with the careful attention of people who had decided to follow the data wherever it led. The subject in the monitoring room shifted slightly in sleep. The stage 5 signature deepened. Eleanor looked at the EM display and thought, there it is. The door opening, as it opens every night for every human being on Earth, as it has opened since the species first lay down and closed its eyes in the dark of a world that was not safe, and found, somehow, that the inside of sleep was safer than the night. The curriculum delivered, the contact made, the signal transmitted, and on the other side of the wall, in the dark of the monitoring room, something patient and enormous and fundamentally kind, waiting as it always had, for the next mind to cross the threshold and remember. Now, if this story has moved something in you, if you have felt, even once, that your dreams were more than your brain talking to itself, if you have woken at 3 a.m. with a presence in the room and a sense of having just returned from somewhere real, if you have always known there was more on the other side of sleep than your civilization's current story about sleep allows, you are right. The evidence exists. The door exists. The contact is happening. And the first step is the one Eleanor took, the willingness to record what is actually there, rather than what you have been told should be there. Begin keeping a threshold journal. The first 5 minutes after waking, before the phone, before the news, before the scheduled self reassembles. Write whatever is present. The fragment, the feeling, the face of someone you don't recognize, the knowledge that arrived from nowhere, the sense of return. Don't explain it yet. Don't translate it back into ordinary meaning. Just record it. Do this for 90 days. Then look at what you have gathered. You will find the curriculum. You will find the signal. You will find the evidence that you have been, every night without knowing it. Exactly where Eleanor went and exactly what the visitor described. Conscious, present, received, and receiving, in the most real classroom that has ever existed. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that go beyond what the official narrative allows. Turn on the notification bell so that when the next one arrives, you are there. And if this story has awakened something, if you feel the pull toward the inner journey, toward the threshold, toward the direct experience of who you are, beyond the version that wakes up with a name and a schedule, the book in the first pinned comment below was written for exactly this moment. Reconnecting with your divine essence. For those who are ready to stop looking outward for confirmation and start finding, inside the deep architecture of themselves, the truth that has been waiting there since before they knew they were looking. The signal is real. The door is open. And you are not here by accident. Until the next story.